3 strikes of the gavel. Each one landed like a rifle crack against the polished walls of the Hart Senate office building's hearing room, and the 217 people packed into the gallery went still without being asked. The fluorescent lights above were the kind that showed every imperfection, every wrinkle in a pressed suit, every stress line around a mouth, every bead of sweat that a man under pressure might prefer the cameras not catch. 8 cameras were rolling. The C-SPAN monitor mounted in the upper right corner of the room displayed a running count of online viewers, 1,400,000, and climbing. Senator Dale Whitfield understood cameras the way a surgeon understood a scalpel. He removed his reading glasses slowly, deliberately, and set them on the mahogany surface before him with the careful precision of a man who had rehearsed this exact gesture. He was 61, silver-haired, broad-shouldered in the way that suggested a former athlete who had since traded his discipline for comfort, and he wore his authority the way some men wore cologne, in quantities that announced themselves before he entered a room. He turned to face the witness table. The woman sitting there was small, not fragile, the word would not have fit her if you watched long enough, but small in the way that a person becomes when they have learned to take up less space than they are entitled to. Her hair was cut short, practical, a dark brown that had begun to gray at the temples in thin strands she had not bothered to conceal. Her jacket was navy blue and had seen a great number of dry cleanings. Her hands were flat on the table in front of her, not folded, not clasped, just flat. Still. Palms down, fingers slightly apart, the way you'd brace yourself on a surface if you needed to move quickly in any direction. Nobody in the room noticed that part. "Ms. Hollis," Whitfield said, his voice pitched to carry without effort. The tone of a man who had held the floor for so long he had stopped thinking about it. "I requested your military service record from the Department of Defense database at 1400 hours yesterday afternoon." He paused. 1 beat, 2. The system returned no results, no unit designation, no deployment dates, no entry date, no separation date. Another pause. Longer this time, because Whitfield knew the value of silence on camera. He spread both hands outward in an expansive gesture that managed to look both reasonable and devastating. "Your name, Ms. Hollis, does not exist in any DoD personnel database accessible to this committee." 217 people held their breath. "You are here today," he continued, "representing a veterans advocacy group and claiming the standing to testify before this committee on matters of federal policy. You have implied in your submitted written testimony that your perspective is informed by first-hand military service." He let the sentence hang. "But you have no record, no unit, no service." He picked up his glasses again. Another rehearsed gesture, the kind that said, "I am a reasonable man who has simply done his homework. Ms. Hollis, you are a fraud standing before the United States Senate." The room erupted. Not loudly. This was a Senate hearing room, not a stadium. But the controlled eruption of 217 people drawing breath at once, of whispers colliding, of someone in the third row of the gallery pulling out a phone. On the C-SPAN monitor, 1,600,000. The number had jumped in the time it took Whitfield to finish his sentence. Mara Hollis did not move. Not her hands, not her face, not the line of her spine, which had not touched the back of her chair in 4 hours. She looked at Whitfield with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned to wait in places where noise gets you killed. 7 seconds passed, then she leaned forward just slightly toward the microphone. "I have nothing to offer the committee at this time," she said. 7 words, measured, level, the vocal equivalent of a horizon. Whitfield raised one eyebrow toward the nearest camera. "Of course you don't." Scattered, nervous laughter moved through the gallery like a wave that wasn't sure it was welcome. In the third row, a young man in his mid-20s shifted in his seat. Tommy Reeves had a left leg that ended at the knee, and the crutches leaning against his chair carried the scuff marks of daily use. He was the reason Mara Hollis was sitting at that table. He was the reason she had driven 8 hours from a rented room in Western Virginia to sit in this room, under these lights, while a senator who had never left the continental United States in a military uniform called her a fraud on live television. Tommy's jaw was tight. His hands gripped his knees. Beside him, Margaret Hollis, 63, soft in the way that mothers of daughters they don't fully understand often are, placed a hand over her mouth. She watched her daughter with an expression that sat somewhere between pride and grief, and a third thing she had no name for. Mara did not look at either of them. If you believe that real heroes don't need to announce themselves, that the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous one, hit that subscribe button right now and join our community. Every week, we tell the stories of men and women who served in the deepest silence, who carried classified burdens that will never make the headlines. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Let's get back to the story. The hearing room of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee occupied the second floor of the Hart Building, a space designed to project institutional gravity. American flags flanked a raised dais where 5 senators sat in a curved arrangement, their nameplates visible to the gallery. Whitfield at the center, elevated and assured. To his left, Senator Joyce Mercer of Connecticut, whose silver bob was as precise as her reputation. To his right, Senator Patricia Holt of Oregon, who had said almost nothing since the session began and whose silence, unlike Whitfield's, felt like something being conserved rather than withheld. Behind the dais's left wing, Craig Ellison sat with a laptop and a second phone, and the particular posture of a man whose entire professional life was the management of other people's images. He was 44, trim, with the kind of careful grooming that suggested meticulous self-awareness. Every 30 seconds, he tilted the laptop screen toward Whitfield, and every 30 seconds, Whitfield gave the smallest nod, a choreography of information that had been running all morning. At the witness table, a small placard read, "M.S. Mara Hollis, Representative Blue Ridge Veterans Coalition." To Mara's far right, at the far edge of the dais area, Lena Park sat with a legal pad and a pen that had stopped moving 15 minutes ago. She was 26, the committee's junior records secretary, and she had spent the morning watching something she could not yet name. She watched Mara's hands on the table, flat, still, positioned with that particular geometry, and she watched the cameras, and she wrote nothing down, because nothing that had happened in the last 4 hours seemed like the kind of thing that belonged in committee minutes. In the third row of the gallery, a man in a navy blue suit sat with the stillness of someone who was not watching the proceedings so much as studying them. Colonel Frank Okafor, retired, USMC, Force Recon, 26 years, had a small silver Marine Corps emblem on his lapel and the kind of seated posture that could only be called parade rest by any other name. He had arrived early. He had chosen a seat with clear sight lines to both the dais and the witness table. He had noticed, within the first 4 minutes of the session, 3 things about Mara Hollis that made him stop looking at his phone. He had not looked at his phone since. Whitfield adjusted his microphone and pressed forward with the precision of a man who had prepared more material than he intended to use. "This committee exists to serve veterans," he said, and his tone softened to something that on camera would read as principle. "Real veterans, men and women who served, who sacrificed, whose records are documented, whose service can be verified. What this committee will not do," he let the word land, "is allow its proceedings to be manipulated by individuals who exploit the emotional weight of military service to advance policy agendas under false pretenses." Joyce Mercer leaned forward slightly. Her voice was quieter than Whitfield's, calibrated for a different kind of impact. "Ms. Hollis, I want to be precise about my concern here. Setting aside the question of your personal history for a moment, the written testimony you submitted to this committee invokes your military experience no fewer than 11 times. 11 times you use your purported service as the foundation for your policy recommendations. If that foundation is false, everything built on it is equally false." She tilted her head. "Wouldn't you agree that represents a serious ethical problem?" Mara looked at her for a moment. "Senator, I would suggest that the ethical weight of this conversation might be better directed at the policy failures affecting the veterans I represent than at the credentials of the person representing them." Mercer's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted. She sat back. From the gallery's far aisle, a man in his early 40s moved toward the press gallery table, Brad Colton, media attorney and communications consultant to Whitfield's re-election campaign, who had been granted observer credentials through a process that Lena Park had flagged in a memo 3 weeks prior and whose memo had been filed and not read. Colton pulled his chair close to the press rail and leaned toward the microphone that had been set up for legal counsel. "If the committee would permit a procedural question." He didn't wait for Whitfield to formally acknowledge him. Under federal statute, a witness testifying before a Senate committee in a representational capacity is implicitly affirming the accuracy of their claimed standing. If that standing cannot be verified, the committee has grounds to Title 18, Mara said. Colton paused. United States Code, Section 1001. Her voice had not changed in volume or tempo. That statute establishes the federal prohibition on false statements in official proceedings. It also establishes, in conjunction with the standards articulated in Doe v. Tenet, 2004, that a witness is not compelled to produce documentation whose disclosure would compromise matters of national security as defined under Executive Order 13526. She looked at Colton directly for the first time. You may want to read the full opinion. The relevant section is on page 47. The room was quiet for a beat longer than was comfortable. Brad Colton said nothing. He clicked his pen once, twice, then put it down. In the third row, Frank Okafor had gone completely still. His eyes moved from Mara to the press table and back. His right hand found his phone. He opened a contacts list and stopped at a name. He did not dial yet. Whitfield recovered with the ease of a man who had survived worse moments than a witness who knew her statute citations. Ms. Hollis, I appreciate the legal theater, I do, but citing case law doesn't produce a service record. He smiled, and the smile was the particular kind that never reached his eyes. I have constituents in this gallery today, Gold Star families, disabled veterans, people who have given years of their lives to this country and who deserve better than to sit here while someone who never wore a uniform lectures this committee on military policy. Tommy Reeves, in the third row, felt the back of his neck go hot. Mara's eyes moved, not to the gallery, not to Whitfield. They moved to the rear of the room, to the door. She looked at it for exactly 1 second, and then she looked back at her hands. Nobody noticed that either. Diane Ferris, credentialed as a staff reporter for a defense policy publication that had received funding through a Whitfield-connected PAX, had been shooting photographs since the session began. She was not interested in the dais. She was interested in Mara's face, specifically in the absence of the reaction she expected to find there. A person falsely accused tends to show it. The body betrays the mind, the micro-tension in the jaw, the involuntary compression of the lips, the slight forward pitch that says, I want to defend myself. Ferris had been photographing people in difficult moments for 14 years. She knew what false accusation looked like. This was not what it looked like. She lowered her camera for a moment and watched. Whitfield was building towards something. It was visible in the way he paused to let Ellison slide a folded sheet of paper across the corner of the dais, a practiced exchange that looked accidental only if you weren't watching for it. Whitfield unfolded the sheet without looking down, scanned it once with the peripheral awareness of a man who reads briefing documents while conducting press conferences, and then folded it again. Senator Mercer, he said, I'd like to note for the record that the committee has identified through a separate DOD records inquiry a military application associated with Ms. Hollis's name, filed in 2003. He turned back to the witness table. The smile was gone. Miss Hollis, you did apply to join the United States military. Your application was rejected. The stated reason he picked up the paper from Ellison and read from it. Failure to meet minimum physical fitness standards for enlistment. The gallery broke. Not in shouts, but in the low, rushing sound of people absorbing something they had been waiting for. Confirmation. Proof. The closing of a question that had been building for an hour. Someone near the back of the room actually laughed. A short, caught sound quickly suppressed. Tommy Reeves closed his eyes. Margaret Hollis's hand moved from her mouth to her chest. Ferris raised her camera and shot 12 frames in 4 seconds. Craig Ellison let out a breath through his nose and typed something rapidly into his laptop. Senator Mercer turned her face slightly away from the witness table, as if the conclusion had been foregone and she preferred not to be caught looking. Brad Colton uncapped his pen again. Whitfield set the paper down. I think we've been patient enough. Ms. Hollis, I'm going to ask security to... That record is accurate. Mara's voice cut through the room the way a straight line cuts through noise. Not loud, not sharp, but completely without deviation. The room went still again. A different kind of still this time. Whitfield's mouth, which had been forming the next sentence, stopped. The application. The rejection. Mara looked at him without expression. That record is accurate. 7 seconds of absolute silence. Frank Okafor, in the third row, was no longer looking at Mara. He was looking at his phone screen, at a series of numbers he had pulled up. His jaw had moved. Barely. The movement of a man doing arithmetic in his head and arriving at an answer that reorganized something fundamental. If this story has your blood boiling right now, you are not alone. The arrogance of unchecked power versus 14 years of classified silence. This is what we cover every single week. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. And if you know a veteran, a military family member, or anyone who believes in honoring real service, send them this video. The best tribute to silent warriors is making sure their stories are heard. We'll be right back. The momentum in the room had shifted in a direction nobody had anticipated, which was the problem with momentum that gets too comfortable. It doesn't account for the possibility that the person at the center of it knows something you don't. Whitfield recovered first because recovery was the skill he had spent 30 years perfecting. Well, he gestured broadly, half to the room, half to the cameras. At least we have honesty on that point. Another small smile. An admitted failed applicant is now demanding that this committee restructure federal veterans policy based on her personal expertise. I think the gallery can draw its own conclusions. The gallery might also be interested in drawing a conclusion about Section Mot Ngin, Haitram Leba B, of the FY 2019 National Defense Authorization Act, Mara said, which your office cited in the committee's pre-hearing brief as justification for the proposed VA funding reduction. The figure you used was $315 million. Whitfield blinked. That's correct? It's not. No apology in the correction. No softening. The provision was amended in the supplemental appropriations bill passed in March of that year. The figure relevant to the committee's current proposal is $270 million. The discrepancy affects the cost-benefit modeling your office submitted by approximately 18%. A pause. Whitfield looked to Ellison. Ellison was already typing, cross-referencing. 4 seconds. 7. He looked back at Whitfield and gave the faintest shake of his head. The figure was wrong. The brief was wrong. The math on which 3 months of policy preparation had been built was wrong. Whitfield set both palms flat on the table. In the third row, Frank Okafor had stopped doing arithmetic and started making a phone call. He stood quietly, moved to the far aisle, and stepped through the side door into the marble corridor beyond with a pace that suggested he was not going far and would not be long. Lena Park noticed him leave. She also noticed that the pen she'd stopped using 20 minutes ago was still in her hand, and that her laptop, which was connected to the committee's internal DoD document access portal, was showing a login prompt for a search she had started 4 minutes ago and had not yet completed. She moved her fingers to the keyboard and pressed enter. The loading wheel spun. It spun for longer than usual. Tommy Reeves, whose right hand had been clenched on his knee since Whitfield read the rejection letter, slowly unclenched it. He was not sure why. Something in the room had changed, and he could not name it, but he felt it in the way you feel a shift in air pressure before weather arrives. Joyce Mercer, who had the political instincts of a person who had survived 4 Senate elections by reading rooms accurately, was very quietly watching Mara Hollis with an expression that had subtly recalibrated. The certainty she'd walked in with was not entirely gone, but it had developed a hairline fracture, and she was aware of it. Ms. Hollis, Mercer's voice had lost some of its edge, setting aside the budget figures for the moment, and I will have my staff verify those numbers independently. I want to return to the fundamental question. You are here claiming to speak for veterans. You have confirmed that you are not, in fact, a veteran. How do you respond to the concern that your presence at this table represents a misuse of a process designed to give voice to those who served? Mara turned to face her directly. Senator, Tommy Reeves served in Helmand Province, Regimental Combat Team 7 from 2013 to 2014. He lost his left leg below the knee to an IED on a road that 4 separate intelligence reports had flagged as high risk, in a province that received 14% of the logistical support requested by his unit commander. He waited 22 months for his VA disability claim to be processed, during which time he lost his apartment, his vehicle, and the college enrollment he had deferred to enlist. She did not raise her voice. You may argue about my credentials. I would respectfully suggest that argument does not change a single day of those 22 months. The room was very quiet. Tommy Reeves looked up. His eyes found Mara's back, and something in his face changed. The tight defensive set of his jaw loosening slightly, the way a person's posture changes when someone says the thing they needed said. Whitfield was not finished. A man with Whitfield's instincts does not reach for his best weapon until the preceding ones have failed, and this, the pivot to the emotional, the invocation of real sacrifice to fill the space where credentials should be, was the moment he had been building toward. He reached for it. I have tremendous respect for Mr. Reeves. he said, his voice dropping to the register he used when he wanted to appear moved. And I think every person in this room has tremendous respect for what he sacrificed. But that sacrifice, he paused, that real, documented, verified sacrifice is precisely why we cannot allow this committee to be used as a platform by someone whose only connection to military service is a rejected enlistment application from 20 years ago. He looked at the gallery, not at Mara. The move was deliberate. He was no longer talking to her. He was talking about her, in front of 217 people and 1,700,000 online viewers. Security, if you would please. The left side door opened, not the main door at the back, through which senators' aides and late-arriving journalists entered. The side door set into the wood-paneled wall to the left of the dais, used by committee staff and persons with escort clearance. The door opened with a click that somehow cut through the ambient sound of the room. Frank Okafor walked back in. He had not been outside long enough for anything unremarkable to have happened. 5 minutes, perhaps 6. He returned to the third row and sat down with the quiet deliberateness of a man who had made a decision. He did not look at Whitfield. He looked at Mara, and then he looked at the side door again, and the expression on his face was the kind that soldiers wear when they have radioed for something and are now waiting for it to arrive. Lena Park's laptop screen changed. She had entered her search parameters into the DoD Personnel Access Portal, a standard query, the kind she ran a dozen times a week for committee background research. Name, date of birth, social security fragment. The system had processed the query and returned a result, but the result was not a file. It was a screen she had never seen before in 3 years of committee work, a gray box with a red border and a set of characters that she read twice because the first reading did not fully register. Access denied. Clearance level 6, required. Contact JSO CGAC J2 for authorization. She stared at it. Her pen was still in her hand. Slowly, carefully, she turned the laptop screen 45 degrees toward the nearest camera. Not enough to be an announcement, just enough to be seen. Brad Colton, who had been watching the room with the perpetual assessment of a man whose job was information management, saw the screen. His pen stopped moving. Diane Ferris, whose camera had been tracking the room's emotional geography, pivoted and shot the laptop screen. Craig Ellison, whose laptop had been connected to the same DoD database through the committee's official access point, tried the same search on his end. His screen returned the identical result. He looked at it for 4 seconds. Then he looked at Whitfield, and in the private language of people who have worked together long enough, something passed between them that was not quite alarm but was certainly not confidence. Mara had not moved. Her hands were still flat on the table. Her eyes had not tracked toward Lena Park's laptop or toward Ellison's reaction. She was looking, very steadily, at the door on the far side of the room, not the side door through which Okafor had returned, but the main entrance at the back. The door she had looked at once before, at the beginning, when no one was watching. Whitfield took a breath and did the thing that experienced politicians do when the ground shifts beneath them. He reached for certainty. A database error does not constitute a military record. Lena. He used the staffer's first name with the casual authority of someone accustomed to treating young women as tools rather than witnesses. Reset the search portal and try again. I've run it 3 times, Senator, Lena said. Her voice was even, but not subservient. The result is consistent. Then there's a system error. Whitfield turned back to the room with the composure of a man who had decided that the safest move was to be loudly reasonable. Ms. Hollis, I want to be very clear about what this committee has established today. You confirmed that your military application was rejected. You cannot produce a service record. A DoD search returns nothing. And yet you sat before this committee in this room on this record. He leaned forward and implied a military background you do not have. He stood up. A senator standing during a hearing is a different instrument than a seated one. The physical elevation, the deliberate breaking of formal posture, signals that the next thing said is meant to end something. I am formally requesting that Capitol Police escort Ms. Hollis from this hearing room. Furthermore, I am initiating a referral to the Senate Ethics Committee regarding the submission of materially misleading written testimony by Senator. The voice was not Mara's. Frank Okafor had risen from his seat in the third row. He was not tall, 5'11", perhaps, but the way he occupied his height left no question about whether he intended to be heard. I'd suggest the committee pause. Whitfield's eyes found him with the reflexive assessment of a man who instantly categorizes threats. Gray suit, Marine emblem, measured posture. He could not immediately place him, which in Whitfield's experience meant this was either a minor figure or someone he should have known and didn't. Sir, this is not an open forum. Colonel Frank Okafor, United States Marine Corps, retired. Force Recon, 26 years. Okafor did not increase his volume. He did not need to. I am speaking as a member of the public in attendance, which your committee rules permit for a period of public comment not to exceed 2 minutes. He looked directly at Whitfield. I know who this woman is. The room went quiet in a way it had not been quiet before. Not the silence of attention, but the silence of something about to change. Whitfield's mouth tightened. Colonel, without documentation. JSOC Zeta, Okafor said. Mission classification, reference 779er Alpha. Two things happened simultaneously. The number of people in the gallery who recognized that reference, 0, possibly 1. But the number of people who could read Mara Hollis's face and see something flicker across it for the first time in 4 hours, a flash so brief it was almost invisible, a single involuntary blink in a face that had been a still surface, was 217. Tommy Reeves was watching her. He had been watching her since the moment Whitfield read the rejection letter, waiting for something. For anger, for shame, for the collapse of whatever she had been holding together up there. He watched her blink once at those 7 characters Okafor had spoken, and what he saw in the fraction of a second between the blink and the stillness returning was not shame. He did not have the vocabulary for what it was, but it was not shame. Whitfield had spent enough years in rooms like this to know when the balance of a confrontation has shifted, and what he felt now was the particular sensation of a floor that has not yet moved, but that the body, on some pre-conscious level, suspects is about to. He would not yield to that sensation. He had not gotten here by yielding. Colonel, without verified documentation, your statement carries no legal weight before this committee. Security, if you would. The door at the back of the room opened. Not the side door, the main entrance. The sound that came with it was different from any sound that door had made all morning. Not the click of a staff member's badge reader, not the push of a journalist's shoulder against wood. It was the sound of a door opened with complete authority by someone who had calculated the precise moment to open it. Chief Warrant Officer Derek Rice walked into the room in service dress blue, United States Navy. The uniform was pressed with a geometric precision that did not allow for human imperfection. Every crease a straight line, every ribbon in its proper order on the left breast of the jacket. He was 42, lean, with the economical posture of a man who had spent so much time in aircraft and water and confined spaces that stillness had become his default state. In his right hand he carried an envelope, standard letter size, heavy stock. The outer surface bore a seal in dark red wax, above which a label had been affixed and typed with machine precision, declassified. Secretary of Defense authorized. Effective date, today. He walked the length of the hearing room's central aisle without slowing, without looking at the gallery, without looking at Whitfield. He reached the witness table. He set the envelope on the surface directly in front of Mara Hollis, parallel to the edge of the table. He straightened. Ma'am, he said. One word. He stepped back 2 paces and placed both hands behind his back. The room was absolutely silent. Whitfield stared at the envelope, at the seal, at the label. His face had undergone a structural reorganization that the cameras were recording in high definition. Craig Ellison's hands had stopped moving. Joyce Mercer was very still. Brad Colton had stood up without deciding to. Mara looked at the envelope for 3 seconds. She placed her left hand on it, pulled it toward her, broke the wax seal with her thumb in a single practiced motion, the way a person opens the 10th envelope of this kind rather than the first. As her arm moved, the left sleeve of her navy jacket, already slightly loosened from 4 hours of rigid posture at the table, shifted upward. 3 inches of her left wrist became visible. Lena Park, whose line of sight to the witness table was direct and unobstructed, was the first to see it clearly. Later, she would not be entirely able to describe what she thought in that moment, only that she stopped breathing for 1 full second. On the inside of Mara Hollis's left wrist was a tattoo, black ink, dense and precise, an anchor. Around it, 7 5-pointed stars arranged in a perfect circle. Beneath the anchor, in capital letters, no larger than a thumbnail, JSOC, Zeta. 3 of the 8 cameras found it automatically, the movement of a wrist and the sudden stillness of the people nearest to it pulling focus the way contrast always pulls focus. Lena Park sat down, though she did not remember standing up. Diane Ferris lowered her camera and looked at it with a different kind of attention than she had used all morning. Frank Okafor, in the 3rd row, placed his left hand flat against his chest in a gesture that was not theatrical, was not planned, was simply the thing his hand did when it encountered something that warranted it. And Mara Hollis opened the folder. The pages inside the folder were not what anyone in the room had expected. Not because they were dramatic in their presentation. They were not. No colored borders, no bold headlines, no formatting designed for impact. They were government documents in the truest sense. White paper, black type, the flat bureaucratic language of institutions that deal in information too consequential for embellishment. But the first page stopped the room the way a single note played in a silent space stops everything around it. A photograph, 4 inches by 3, black and white, which in the context of a post-2000 military file meant deliberate, meant the color had been stripped for reasons that were not cosmetic. The woman in the photograph was younger, perhaps by 15 years, perhaps more, the face harder to date because the face itself had not changed in the ways most faces change. The hair was longer in the photograph. She wore a tactical garment rather than a navy jacket. She was not looking at the camera the way people look at cameras. She was looking through it, at the person holding it, with the exact quality of focus that Mara Hollis had been directing at various points in this room all morning. The measuring look, the calculating stillness. Beneath the photograph, in 12-point type, Hollis, Mara Jean. Rank, Master Chief Petty Officer. Branch, United States Navy. Unit, JSOC Ghost Unit Zeta. Clearance, above top secret, special compartmentalized information. Years of service, 14. Missions declassified, partial. 6. Current status, inactive reserve or cover assignment terminated as of today's date. At the bottom of the page, above a signature and an official seal, by order of the Secretary of Defense, declassification authorized under Title 50, United States Code, Section 3161. Dale Whitfield read it from 6 feet away. Then he read it again. The experience of having the ground move beneath you when you are standing still is one of the more disorienting things available to the human nervous system. And what Whitfield felt in those 2 readings was precisely that. Not the ground shifting because the hearing room floor had not moved an inch, but the substrate of everything he had spent the last 4 hours constructing collapsing in a way that the marble beneath his feet could do nothing to prevent. He stood up, then he sat down, then he stood up again. The cameras caught all of it. "This is," he began, and the sentence did not finish itself, because the next word he reached for was not there. He looked for Ellison. Ellison was staring at his own laptop screen where the DoD portal had returned its 3rd consecutive access denied in the past 12 minutes, and his hands, those quick, controlled hands that had been managing information all morning, were still on the keys and not moving. Joyce Mercer had pushed her chair back from the dais by approximately 4 inches. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the physical equivalent of a comma. A pause inserted into her proximity to what was happening. She had both hands in her lap. Her eyes were on the folder, specifically on the corner of the photograph that Mara had turned to face the room. Brad Colton had stood without deciding to, and now stood without sitting back down, the legal notepad in his hand held in the loose, forgotten way of a man whose hands have stopped receiving instructions from the rest of him. He looked at the folder, he looked at the door, he picked up his suit jacket from the back of the chair with a movement that was casual in the way that only very deliberate movements can appear casual. Frank Okafor was already standing. He did not move toward the witness table. He stood in his row in the 3rd gallery with his shoulders back and his chin level and his left hand flat against the front of his jacket over his chest, the gesture that had come to him involuntarily when he first saw the wrist, and which he had not lowered. Tommy Reeves had both hands on the arms of his gallery chair, and he was leaning forward in the way of a person whose body has committed to standing before his mind has finished the calculation. His crutches were still propped against the wall to his left. He had not reached for them yet. He would, in a moment. But for now he leaned forward and looked at the back of the woman at the witness table and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the room had not already said. Margaret Hollis, 63 years old, who had raised a daughter she had never fully understood, A daughter who called on Sundays and gave short answers to long questions, who visited twice a year and moved through the family home with a particular careful alertness that Margaret had always attributed to something she couldn't name. Sat with her hand no longer covering her mouth. Her hand was in her lap. She was looking at the photograph on the first page of the open folder. She was looking at her daughter's face in that photograph, and she was understanding, for the first time, the weight of every "I'm fine, Mom," and every deflected question and every Sunday call that ended before she was ready for it to end. Her eyes were dry. She was past the kind of emotion that produces tears. She was in the kind that sits in the chest and breathes. Lena Park, standing. She had stood at some point without marking the moment, took 3 steps from her position at the side of the dais and stopped at the edge of the witness table. She did not touch anything. She stood there with her legal pad against her chest, like a person who has found their way to the right place without a map. The online viewer count on the C-SPAN monitor had passed 3,200,000. Marcus Webb, the C-SPAN cameraman in the far left position, had not moved his camera from the witness table in 4 minutes. Mara turned the second page. Derek Rice, standing 2 paces behind her, looked at nothing in particular. His posture remained what it had been since he entered, precise, at rest, the stance of someone who has delivered what they came to deliver and is now simply present for whatever follows. Ms. Hollis. Whitfield's voice had lost its calibration. It was the voice of a man reaching for a register he had misplaced. The provenance of these documents needs to be... Senator? Patricia Holt's voice cut through the room from its position at the far right of the dais, where it had been silent for over 2 hours. She was 67, gray-haired, with the quality of composure that comes not from hiding emotion, but from having long since made peace with it. She had served on this committee for 11 years. She had a son who had served in Ramadi. She looked at Whitfield with the particular patience of someone who has decided that the kindest available option is directness. Dale, stop. 2 words. The room heard them as if they were 200. Whitfield's mouth closed. What just happened in that room is exactly why this channel exists. Real service doesn't come with press releases. It comes with classified folders and 15 years of absolute silence. If this moment hit you the way it hit us, drop a comment below. Tell us where in the world you're watching from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, join our community of people who believe the shadows are full of heroes. Stay with us. We're not done. The second page of the folder was a summary document, partially redacted, with solid black bars covering certain passages that would not be declassified today or any day soon. What was visible was sufficient. 6 missions, 3 in Afghanistan, provinces named, operations numbered, outcomes summarized in the flat language of after-action reports that described extraordinary events as simply as weather. 1 in Iraq, listed as direct action against a high-value target network. Completion status, successful. 1 entry with the location field entirely redacted, not blacked out in the way of a specific name or coordinate, but absent, as if the location itself was a classification category, as if naming where it had occurred would communicate more than the name. And the 6th, operation designation, classified. Mission type, long-term infiltration, intelligence collection. Duration, 5 years. Target, transnational terrorist financing network. Status complete. Result, network infrastructure disrupted. Multiple secondary subjects identified for federal prosecution. Below that last entry, a note had been added in the declassification process. A single line that someone at the secretary's level had authorized for release, presumably because its release was the point. Note. Secondary subject financial documentation transferred to FBI Counterintelligence Division. Referral package completed. Date. See current authorization. The date on the authorization was today's date. Mara turned the page to the third. The third page was not redacted. The third page was the one that had been placed in the folder specifically because today was the day it was meant to be seen. It was a financial summary document. 2 columns on the left listed organizational names, shell companies, holding entities, pass-through accounts. The right column listed transaction dates, amounts, and ultimate recipient designations. The document covered the period from 2018 to 2021. The total figure at the bottom of the right column was $412,000. 3/4 of the way down the left column, third entry from the bottom, was a name that had not appeared in any of the morning's testimony. Whitfield Capital Holdings LLC, 3 intermediary accounts. Indirect transfer through a registered nonprofit in Delaware and a financial services firm in Vienna, Austria. The terminal recipient of the funds, routed through a sequence of steps that had taken 5 years of embedded access to trace, was listed by the document's source reference as a designated foreign terrorist organization. Mara set the page flat on the table surface, precisely parallel to the folder's spine, and turned it so that its text faced outward toward the cameras. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The silence that followed was of a different quality from any silence the room had experienced that morning. It was not the silence of shock, that had a texture to it, a kind of audible held breath. This was the silence of a room in which 217 people were reading the same document at the same time and arriving, each in their own sequence, at the same 3 words in the left column. The first person to say something was not Whitfield. It was not Mercer or Holt. It was not Colton or Ellison. It was Marcus Webb, the C-SPAN cameraman, who said, very quietly, in the tone of a man talking to himself without meaning to, "Holy cow." The online viewer count passed 4 million. Craig Ellison pushed back from the dais table and stood in a single motion. "Senator, there's a call I need to. Mr. Ellison." The voice came from the back of the room, not the gallery, not the press area. The back corner near the secondary entrance that committee staff used for document deliveries, and that had been, as far as most people in the room had noticed, unmanned all morning. A woman in a dark suit stepped forward from that corner with the unhurried authority of someone who had been in the room for longer than anyone had realized and had been waiting for exactly this moment. She was 41, her badge already open in her left hand, her right hand at her side in the particular position of a person who is relaxed but aware of where their right hand is. Special Agent Sandra Torres, Federal Bureau of Investigation. "Mr. Ellison, I'd ask you to remain seated." She walked toward the dais without haste, flanked by 2 other agents who materialized from positions along the side wall. "Senator Whitfield, this committee is in receipt of a federal warrant issued by the United States District Court for the District of Columbia." She reached the front of the room and set a document on the dais table directly in front of Whitfield with the same flat precision Rice had used when setting the envelope in front of Mara. "We'll need to speak with you and several members of your staff privately, immediately following the conclusion of this hearing." The warrant landed on the mahogany. Whitfield stared at it. In 29 years of public life, Dale Whitfield had been in contentious hearings, difficult press conferences, and a primary challenge so close that the recount had taken 11 days. He had been outmaneuvered before. He had been caught in contradictions before. He had faced bad days and managed them with the tools that politics provides: delay, redirection, the leveraging of doubt. But the tools of politics assume a playing field that operates on political logic, and what had entered this room in the last 14 minutes was not political. It was evidentiary, and evidence does not negotiate. He looked at Torres, then at the warrant, then at Mara, and for the first time the fluency failed him completely. What emerged was the sentence of a man who is prepared for many contingencies and not for this one. "She brought this here. She arranged this. This whole proceeding was a setup to..." "Senator." Patricia Holt set both her hands on the dais table and rose from her chair with the measured gravity of someone ending a meeting that has run past its useful point. "This committee stands in temporary recess." She looked at the cameras deliberately, acknowledging them in the way that senators do when they want the record to reflect something beyond the transcript. "The Veterans Affairs Committee will reconvene after consulting with legal counsel regarding several matters that have arisen in today's proceedings." She paused. "Including, and I want to be precise on this point for the record, a significant discrepancy in the budget figures submitted in the committee's pre-hearing brief, which a witness today corrected in real time. That correction will be noted in the official record." She looked at Mara once. It was a brief look, professional, measured, with something behind it that was neither sympathy nor apology, but was closer to the kind of acknowledgement that serious people extend to other serious people when the formal language of the setting does not allow for more. She gathered her materials and walked from the dais. The room broke. Not into chaos. The room had too much institutional gravity for chaos, but into the controlled explosion of 217 people processing something at once, the low roar of voices finding each other, the scrape of gallery chairs, the rapid percussion of keyboards, the sound of someone in the press gallery speaking at speed into a phone. Brad Colton was already moving toward the exit. He was halfway to the door when Frank Okafor stepped into the aisle without raising a hand or saying a word. Simply stepped into the space Colton needed to pass through and looked at him, and Colton stopped. The two men regarded each other for a moment. Colton looked down. He went back to his seat. Diane Ferris had stopped photographing Mara's face. She was photographing the third page of the folder, the financial summary, the column, the name, with the careful, deliberate framing of a journalist who understands that she is looking at the document that will rewrite every story she has written in the last 3 years. Torres, having delivered the warrant, stood at a measured distance and let the moment settle before her next move. The two agents flanking her had taken positions that made it clear, without aggression, that certain people in the room were not leaving without a conversation. Tommy Reeves had his hand on his crutch. He got to his feet slowly. The process of standing when you have one leg and crutches and have been sitting in an adrenaline-filled room for 4 hours is not graceful. But Tommy Reeves had long since stopped apologizing for the time it took. He stood. He turned toward the witness table where Mara still sat, had not moved, had not risen to receive congratulations or turned to acknowledge the room. He took 3 steps with his crutches, stopped at the railing between the gallery and the hearing floor, looked at the back of her head. "Ma'am," he said. It was not loud enough to cut through the room's noise, but it was loud enough. Mara turned. He was not sure what he'd expected. The face of someone who had won something perhaps, or the face of someone finally unburdened. What he found instead was the same face he had been watching all morning. Level. Still. The eyes that assessed rather than performed. But for the first time since he had taken his seat in this room before 7 a.m., he saw something else behind that stillness, something that was not relief exactly but was in the same neighborhood. The expression of a person who has been carrying something for a very long time and has set it down somewhere it can be examined in proper light. "Thank you," he said, because he could not find anything more adequate and had learned enough in the past 3 years to know that adequate was sometimes what the moment needed, not eloquent. She looked at him for a moment. "That's what the work was for," she said. 6 words, shorter than any answer she had given all morning, and the most complete. Margaret Hollis had not moved from her seat. The gallery around her had come alive with motion and conversation, but she sat in it like a stone in a current, still, while the noise moved around her. She was looking at the witness table, at her daughter's back. She had been looking at her daughter's back for 4 hours and had thought she was watching a stranger and had now discovered she had been watching all along, the person she thought she knew least well and had in fact never known at all. That was not a grief she could process in this room. It would take longer than a room allowed. But she sat with the beginning of it, the first edge of it, and she did not cry, because the feeling was too large for tears. It was the feeling of an entire understanding of a person being rebuilt from the foundation. Lena Park had picked up the folder from the table after Mara set the 3rd page flat. She held it carefully, both hands, the way you hold something that belongs to an archive. She looked at the pages once more, the photograph, the mission summary, the financial document, and then she found a folder-sized evidence envelope in the committee's document supply cart and slid the contents in with precise, deliberate movements. She sealed it. She initialed it in the designated field. She wrote the date and time. She would file it correctly. That was her job. She would do her job. Derek Rice remained 2 paces behind the witness table, hands clasped behind his back, expression neutral. He had not moved since setting the envelope down. He was, in the way of people trained for long-duration patience, simply present, available if needed, invisible if not. Torres approached the witness table from the side, away from the main floor action. She stopped at a respectful distance. "Master Chief." Mara stood. In a room where people had been rising and sitting for 4 hours based on the tidal patterns of power, this particular rising was different. She stood without urgency, without ceremony, without the self-consciousness of a person performing an exit. She straightened her jacket. This was the detail that 3 separate journalists would note in their accounts of the afternoon. Wearing the same jacket she had walked in with, same slightly worn navy fabric, same practical cut. She had not changed. She had not needed to. "Agent Torres," Mara said. "You knew we'd be here today," Torres said. It was not an accusation. It was the observation of one professional acknowledging another's timeline. The referral package was completed before I walked into this building, Mara said. Your office had it at 0800. Torres nodded once. We may need a formal statement. You have my number. Torres stepped back. The professional courtesy was mutual. Torres had been working this case for 11 months, 2 of which had been spent following a thread that led, eventually, to a file with a clearance level that required 3 separate authorizations to view a single paragraph of. She had read enough of what was visible in that file to understand something important about the woman at the witness table, which was that the evidence she had assembled was not the product of someone settling a score. It was the product of someone who had a job and did it. That distinction mattered to Torres in the way it mattered to everyone in her field who had been doing it long enough. From the dais, she heard Craig Ellison say to one of the agents flanking him, "I want to speak to counsel," and she heard the agent respond, "That's your right, sir. We can arrange that at the field office." And she heard the particular silence that followed, which was the silence of a man understanding that the perimeter he had been managing has moved. Brad Colton, from his seat, said nothing. He had taken his phone out and was looking at the contact list, and then he was not looking at it because there was no call to be made that improved his position. And the practice of good legal instinct is knowing when there is nothing useful to dial. Before we get to the final chapter, if you've made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person we create these stories for. Share this video, not for us, for the veterans who will never be able to share their own stories. Leave a comment, hit subscribe, and stay until the very last second. You do not want to miss what comes next. Outside the hearing room, in the marble corridor of the Hart Building, the word was already moving. A staffer for a senator on the Foreign Relations Committee had been watching the C-SPAN feed on a tablet during a break and had sent a text that became 3 texts that became 20. In the press gallery on the building's main floor, 2 reporters who had not been credentialed for this hearing were already moving toward the elevators. On the building's security monitors, a supervisor was watching the online viewer count. 4,000,007, 4,000,009, 5,000,001, climbing in increments now rather than jumps, and making a call about whether to increase presence outside the hearing room. The answer was yes. Back in the hearing room, Frank Okafor made his way to the witness area through the dispersing crowd with the practiced navigation of a man who knows how to move through a space without creating friction. He reached the floor near the witness table and stopped at the appropriate distance. Not the distance of familiarity, but the distance of respect, the distance that soldiers who do not know each other's names but recognize each other's bearing maintain without being taught to. He came to attention. Not parade ground attention. This was not a parade ground, but the adjustment of posture that carries the meaning. Mara returned it. The exact same angle, the same quality of stillness, the acknowledgement between people who have never met and share a language that was not taught in any classroom. 26 years, Mara said. Force recon, he confirmed. I recognized the stance inside the first 4 minutes, the way you position before movement. Nobody sits like that unless they've been trained to be ready to move from seated. You made a call. 2. One to an old contact at Naval Special Warfare. One to a colonel I know at the Pentagon. He paused. I wanted to be sure I wasn't wrong about what I was seeing. Were you? Okafor looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has been in enough situations to distinguish between performances and the thing itself. No, he said simply. I was not wrong. Tommy Reeves had gotten himself down from the gallery to the hearing floor on his crutches, the descent of 3 steps requiring the specific calculation of a person who has made such calculations so many times that it is no longer something he thinks about, but simply something he does. He stood near the edge of the floor space, slightly to the side, with the instinct of someone who did not want to interrupt a conversation that looked like it mattered. But Mara turned to him before he had to decide whether to speak. She looked at him the way she had looked at him once before, across the space of the railing, but now without the barrier. He was 24 years old, 22 months of waiting, 1 leg he would never get back. She had read his case file 8 times in the 6 months before this hearing. She knew the dates better than he did. Better, in some ways, than he allowed himself to know them, because knowing them too well was one of the ways that the waiting got worse. Your claim goes back before the committee next month, she said. Senator Holt's office has the full documentation package. After today, there is not a committee member in that room who will table this. Tommy nodded. His jaw was working. He had not expected to hear the specific thing, the practical thing. He had been braced for something larger and vaguer, the kind of acknowledgement that felt important in a room but dissolved before it reached the door. What she had said instead was a date and a process and a predicted outcome, which was the thing he had actually needed for 22 months and had not received from anyone who had the standing to give it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And then, because he was 24 and had been in rooms with people who outranked him for most of his adult life, "Is that—" He stopped, started again. "Were you always going to be here, for this?" Mara considered the question seriously, which was more than most people would have done. "I was always going to be here for you," she said. "What happened in the rest of the room?" She glanced once at the dais, at the space where Whitfield had been sitting. "That was always going to happen eventually. Today just made it happen in front of the right cameras." It was the most she had said at once since the hearing began. Lieutenant General, retired Howard Briggs, arrived through the main entrance at the back of the room 11 minutes after Torres had served the warrant, which was 14 minutes after Derek Rice had walked in, which was 53 minutes before the evening news would run its first segment on what the anchors were already describing in their production meetings as the hearing that changed three things simultaneously. Briggs was 68, moved with the particular authority of a man who had stopped needing to demonstrate authority 2 decades ago and now simply was it, and he went directly to the press pool that had formed near the sidewall. "I served with Master Chief Hollis in contexts I am not able to describe fully," he said, without preamble, without a prepared statement, the way generals who have been in enough situations speak when the situation does not require polish. "What I can tell you is that the only fraudulent thing I observed in that hearing room today was the allegation itself." He paused, and the pause was not theatrical. It was the pause of a man choosing his next words with the care they deserved. The service she gave this country was real. The cost of it was real. And the silence she maintained for 14 years, that was not weakness. That was the job, the hardest part of the job. He looked at the reporters. "Any questions you have about her record should be directed to the Department of Defense. What I can tell you from my own experience is that the operators I trusted most, in the most consequential moments of my career, were the ones exactly like her, the ones you never saw coming, the ones who didn't need you to know." He did not stay for follow-up questions. He walked to the witness table where Mara was standing with the careful stillness she had maintained all day, and he extended his hand. She took it. The handshake was brief. No one spoke. The exchange had the quality of a signal rather than a ceremony. Two people confirming, through the pressure of hands, something they had both already known. In the gallery, the standing ovation had begun. It had started with Tommy Reeves, who had both hands on his crutches and could not clap, but who had made the decision to stand at the moment when Whitfield's warrant landed on the table and had not sat back down. The sound he made was not applause. It was presence. The presence of a young man with one leg standing in a room where people had just spent 4 hours trying to make his advocate disappear and refusing to sit. Then the person to his left stood. Then 3 people in the row behind. Then the back wall of the gallery, where a cluster of veterans advocates who had attended the hearing in professional capacity had been standing since the second page of the folder, and who were not applauding so much as simply placing their bodies upright, which in this room and in this moment was its own kind of statement. 217 people, over the course of 90 seconds, stood. Margaret Hollis stood last. She stood the way a person stands when their legs are not entirely certain but their intention is absolute, pushing herself up from the gallery seat with both hands braced on the armrests, straightening until she was fully upright, and then standing there in the noise of 200 voices and looking at her daughter's back from across the room. Mara did not turn. She was looking at the folder, which Lena Park had placed in its evidence envelope and was now carrying with both hands toward the committee's document-secure box at the side of the room. The folder was doing what it needed to do. It was in the right hands. That was enough. She reached into the inside breast pocket of her jacket, the left side, the side where the wrist was visible now, where it would remain visible until she chose to cover it again, and removed something small, a medal, no ribbon. The ribbon had been removed years ago, not from ceremony but because ribbons mark occasions, and the occasion this medal was given for was not something she observed as an occasion, just a day. One of 14 years of days. She held it in her palm for a moment. The Navy Cross. On its face, an anchor crossed with a ribbon, the American eagle centered above. On its reverse, nothing except the standard engraving, because the citation it corresponded to was classified and had been classified and would remain classified. and the people who knew why it had been awarded were mostly scattered across assignments she could not name in rooms she could not describe, doing work that the public would not hear about until it was already over and the records had been reviewed, and the appropriate parties had decided what the appropriate parties always decided about what to release and what to keep. She set it on the security check table as she passed through the exit. Paul Denton, the heart-building security officer at the checkpoint, was 47, a veteran himself, Army, 2 tours, the kind of service that does not produce medals but produces the ability to recognize something when you encounter it. He looked at the medal. He looked at the woman who had set it down. He looked at the wrist. He stood straight. He had not been asked to. No protocol required it. No one in the building's manual of operations specified what a security officer should do when a Master Chief Petty Officer of the United States Navy passes through a checkpoint after a Senate hearing. But Paul Denton came to attention because his body knew something his manual did not cover, which was that some things are owed regardless of the instruction manual, and that standing straight is sometimes simply the right response to what you are witnessing. Mara paused. She looked at him. A brief nod. Not condescending, not warm in the performed way, but direct. The acknowledgement between people who understand certain things without requiring them to be said. She walked through the door. Derek Rice followed 2 paces behind, as he had since the beginning, as he would until the next thing began. The marble corridor of the Hart building was full of sound, voices, footsteps, the faint echo of something coming from the direction of the elevators that might have been the beginning of a news report. Outside, through the glass of the building's main entrance, the November light over Capitol Hill was the low, horizontal kind that makes the limestone buildings glow without warmth, and the traffic on 2nd Street was moving with the ordinary indifference of a city that has not yet processed what happened in one room at one table at one afternoon. In the back of the car, a nondescript sedan, government plates, the kind of vehicle that is designed to look like nothing from every angle. Race sat in the passenger seat and Mara sat behind him, and for several blocks neither of them spoke, which was the habit of people who work in silence and are comfortable in it. The city moved past the windows. Race's phone, a device with no manufacturer's branding on its case, a number that routed through 3 different exchanges, vibrated against the cup holder. He looked at the screen, held it without pressing anything. Then, without comment, he turned and passed it back between the seats. Mara took it. The screen displayed 2 words in unformatted text. No sender identification. No timestamp visible. Next target, she read it. Turned the phone face down against her palm. Looked out the window at the Capitol dome moving past, growing smaller as the car proceeded south. The dome was lit against the November sky, white and clean, the way important things are lit for public consumption while the decisions that matter are made in offices without windows. 14 years, she had tracked a network that moved money across 6 countries through 43 intermediary accounts and had never, in all that time, surfaced the way a person surfaces from deep water, gasping, oriented, grateful for the air. She had surfaced the way submarines surface, deliberately under control when the mission required it. The mission had required it today. She turned the phone back over and looked at the 2 words again. The network was not finished. Whitfield's name in the column was 3rd from the bottom, which meant there were 2 names below it she had not declassified today, which meant there were 2 more sets of records in a secure file at the JSOC Gach Noy High office that were waiting for the appropriate authorization to follow the appropriate thread to the appropriate conclusion. She had done this before. She handed the phone back to Rice without speaking. He pocketed it without asking. Some questions did not require asking when the person beside you had already provided the answer in the quality of their silence. Back in the Hart building, Lena Park sealed the evidence envelope with the committee's official tape and initialed the seal with her name and the date and the time. She set it in the secure document box with the care of a person who understands that paper holds things that matter more than the paper itself. Then she sat down at her position at the side of the dais and opened the folder one more time before submitting it to committee custody. She had seen the 3rd page. She had seen the list. She had also seen what no one else in the room had time to look at. The very last item in the folder, a single handwritten note on a quarter sheet of plain paper that had been clipped behind the last page of official documentation. The handwriting was small and precise, the ink black, the letters evenly spaced in the way of someone trained to write in low-light conditions where legibility was a tactical priority. She read it twice. Then she sat with it for a long moment. The note said, "The Zeta network remains active. Whitfield is not the only name on that list. She thought about what that meant. She thought about the 3 years she had spent in this building processing documents and running database searches and filing committee minutes, and about the way the work of accountability, real accountability, the kind that did not end with a warrant and a gavel, always had more rooms beyond the room you were standing in. She placed the note back inside the envelope. She sealed it. She initialed it again over the new seal. In the gallery, where the crowd was thinning as people moved toward the exits and the corridor beyond, Craig Ellison walked with one of Torres's agents in the particular posture of a man who is walking voluntarily toward a car and who is aware that the optional quality of this walk has a precise expiration time. As he passed the main door's threshold, he turned his head back toward the hearing room, toward the dais where he had sat all morning, toward the witness table where the folder had been, toward the space where the afternoon had changed direction. The expression on his face was not the expression of a man who has been caught. It was the expression of a man who is waiting for something. Torres noted it. She made a mental notation of the angle of his head and the particular quality of his stillness in that half-second of turning, and she filed it in the part of her mind that held things that would need to be revisited at 2 a.m. when the rest of the day had settled. In the sedan moving south, Mara's phone, her own phone, the one with a number her mother had, buzzed once. She looked at it. A text from a number she recognized. One word, confirmed. She set it face down on the seat. Outside, Washington moved past, the city built for public decisions and public ceremonies above a substrate of things the public would never fully know, the whole apparatus of democratic governance and its shadows operating simultaneously, each layer unaware of the others or choosing not to be. 14 years. She looked through the glass at the Capitol's dome, now small against the November sky, and she said the thing. Not to race, not to the driver, not to the phone on the seat or the 2 words on its screen or the names on the 3rd page of the folder that were still, as of this afternoon, protected by classifications that would take more time and more work and more of the kind of silence she had sustained for 14 years. She said it to the window. They haven't found half of it. The sedan continued south. The dome disappeared behind a building. The sky was the low, horizontal November kind, and the city kept moving the way cities keep moving, indifferently, continuously, full of rooms where decisions are made and undone and made again. In the Hart Building's hearing room, Paul Denton walked back to the security checkpoint and picked up the medal that Mara had set on his table. He held it in his palm for a moment, looking at it the way you look at something you have been trusted to recognize. He placed it in an evidence bag. He sealed it. He wrote on the label, in the careful handwriting of a man who wanted to get the detail right, left by witness, voluntarily, Navy Cross, no ribbon, authentication requested. He set it in the secure intake box. Somewhere in the building, above the sound of the ventilation system and the faint echo of the corridor's foot traffic and the distant tone of an elevator arriving, a phone rang, then stopped, then rang again. And in a room on the 3rd floor that nobody in the gallery had known was occupied this afternoon, a man Lena Park had never seen put on a jacket and reached for a file and walked toward the elevator, the file thick with papers that began with the same heading as the one that had been opened at the witness table, JSOC Ghost Unit Zeta, and that contained 6 more names below the ones that had been declassified today. 6 more names. The elevator arrived. He stepped inside. The doors closed. 3 days after the hearing, Lena Park received a phone call from a number she did not recognize. She almost did not answer it. She was sitting at her desk in the committee's administrative office, working through the backlog of correspondence that had accumulated while the hearing's aftermath consumed the building's attention. The press inquiries, the formal statements, the procedural filings that followed any session that ended with a federal warrant being served at the dais table. There were 47 unread emails in her queue. Her legal pad had 2 pages of notes she had not yet typed into the official record. The evidence envelope she had sealed and initialed was in the committee's secure archive on the floor below, and she had not stopped thinking about the note inside it since the moment she read it. The phone rang a second time. She answered. "Miss Park," a woman's voice. Measured, professional, the particular vocal quality of someone who chose every word before speaking it. "My name is not something I'm going to give you over this line. What I can tell you is that you handled the documentation this afternoon with exactly the care it deserved, and that the person who put that note in the folder wanted you specifically to find it." Lena set down her pen. "Why me?" "Because you're the one who ran the database search. You're the one who turned the screen toward the camera. You made a decision in that room that most people in your position would not have made, and it was noticed. Outside the office window, the Capitol grounds were gray and cold under a November sky that had not decided whether to rain. Lena watched a group of tourists on the Eastern Plaza, small at this distance, moving in the patient cluster of people following a guide. "What does the note mean?" she said. It was not entirely a question. "It means the work isn't finished." A pause. Not hesitation. The pause of someone allowing a statement to land fully before continuing. The folder that was opened in that hearing room contained 6 declassified missions and 1 financial document. What it did not contain, what it could not contain by the terms of the authorization, was everything that came before those 6 missions and everything that was still active at the time the authorization was signed. "There are more names. There are always more names," the woman said. "The question is whether the right people are in the right positions to do something about them when the time comes." The call lasted 4 minutes and 23 seconds. When it ended, Lena sat at her desk with the phone still in her hand and looked at the 47 unread emails and thought about what it meant to be in the right position and whether she had chosen that position or whether it had, in some way she could not fully articulate, chosen her. She opened a new document on her computer. She began to type. On the same evening, in an apartment in the Anacostia neighborhood of Washington that was rented under a name that did not appear in any hearing room transcript, Craig Ellison sat across a kitchen table from a man he had not seen in 3 years and had hoped not to see again for longer. The man's name was not something Ellison used aloud in rooms where he could not verify the walls. He was 53, European by origin, American by residence, and professional by a definition that polite company did not employ. He had a scar above his left eye that he had stopped explaining years ago, and a way of occupying a room that suggested he was always calculating exit routes. Not from anxiety, but from habit so deeply ingrained it had become indistinguishable from personality. "The folder," the man said. He did not ask it as a question. "How much?" 6 missions. Ellison kept his voice flat. He had learned in the years of their professional association that emotional register was a form of information he preferred not to donate. 1 financial summary, 14 accounts listed, 3 entities named. Whitfield was the third. The third. The man turned a glass of water on the table without drinking from it. Not the first. Not the first. Then the first 2 are still protected. Ellison looked at the table. Outside, the street below carried the ordinary sound of a neighborhood at 8 p.m. A car, a door, someone's television through a thin wall. The sounds of people living lives that did not intersect with this kitchen table and what was said at it. "For now," Ellison said. The man stood, straightened his jacket, and picked up a coat from the back of his chair with the unhurried movement of someone who has never once left a room in a hurry. "Then we have time," he said, "and we have work." He walked to the door. At the threshold he turned back, and in the fraction of a second before he spoke, Ellison saw the thing he always saw in this man's eyes when they reached the end of a conversation. Not calculation exactly, but the closed-door quality of a person to whom other people's futures are operational variables. "Tell me one thing," the man said. "The woman, the operator, was she the end of this or the beginning?" Ellison considered it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to consider things that mattered. "I don't know." The man nodded as if this were the correct answer. He left. Ellison sat at the kitchen table for a long time after the door closed, and he thought about the expression on Mara Hollis's face when she had set the 3rd page of the folder parallel to the table's edge and turned it toward the cameras. He had been watching her face in that moment specifically because he had needed to know whether she was surprised by what the page contained, whether the financial documentation had been an intelligence product she had assembled or one she had been handed. What he had seen was neither surprise nor performance. What he had seen was the face of a person for whom this particular moment was one point on a line that extended in both directions beyond what anyone in the room could see. Not a conclusion, a coordinate. He thought about what that meant. He thought about it for a long time. Tommy Reeves drove back to his apartment in Falls Church, Virginia at 9:47 p.m., taking the route that added 11 minutes to the trip because it went past the Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall on Lee Highway, where he had attended his first meeting after coming home, where an older veteran named Gerald had told him, not unkindly but without softening, that the hardest part of the transition was not the physical, was not the prosthetic or the phantom pain or the relearning of every physical task he had taken for granted, but the loss of purpose. The sense that the structure that had given his days their shape and his choices their weight had been removed and replaced with nothing of comparable substance. He drove past the VFW hall and continued to his apartment. He sat in his car for a few minutes after parking. He thought about what Mara had said to him, not the larger things, not the procedural update about the committee timeline, or the confirmation that the documentation was complete. He thought about the smaller thing, the thing she had said when he asked whether she had always been going to be there. I was always going to be here for you. He had been in enough rooms with enough people over the past 3 years, doctors, caseworkers, advocates, well-meaning strangers, to know the difference between a statement made to provide comfort and a statement made because it was true. He was not entirely sure why he knew the difference. He thought it might be one of the things that the deployment had given him that he had not asked for and had not known what to do with until he needed it. He got out of the car. He went inside. He sat at his kitchen table, smaller than Ellison's, better lit, with a coffee mug and an open textbook on the surface because he was taking 2 online courses and had not stopped taking them through any of the past 3 years, through the waiting and the appeals and the 22 months and all the rest. And he opened the textbook. He read for 2 hours. Before he went to sleep, he sent one message. Not to Mara. He did not have her number, and he was fairly certain that whatever number she used was not the kind you sent casual texts to. He sent it to Gerald from the VFW hall, who was 71 and had served in Vietnam, and checked his messages with the inconsistency of a man who had not grown up with phones and had never fully made his peace with them. I think I met someone today who understood the point of all of it, Tommy wrote. I don't know how to explain it better than that. He put down his phone. Gerald would read it in the morning and would respond with something short and true the way he always did. That was enough for tonight. Margaret Hollis took the train home. She had come to Washington by train, 7 hours from Charlottesville, a trip she had made twice before in her life for occasions she could describe, unlike this one, which she had come to because her daughter had asked her to be there, which in 23 years of her daughter asking very little was sufficient reason to come regardless of the specifics. She sat in the window seat of the southbound train and watched the November landscape move past. The bare trees, the gray fields, the small towns that appeared and disappeared like thoughts. And she held in her lap a photograph she had taken from her wallet before the hearing and had been holding, on and off, since the afternoon. It was an old photograph. Mara at 16 standing in the backyard of their house in Charlottesville in the particular way of teenagers in photographs. Slightly self-conscious, slightly impatient, the expression of someone who has been asked to stop moving long enough for the camera. She was wearing a blue sweater. She was looking slightly to the left of the camera, as if something off-frame had caught her attention. Margaret had looked at this photograph hundreds of times in the past 23 years. She had always understood it as a picture of a young woman who was already somewhere else in her mind, already looking towards something Margaret could not see. She understood it differently now. She was not grieving exactly. She had not lost anything today. What she had lost, the version of her daughter she thought she knew, the narrative she had constructed from Sunday phone calls and twice-yearly visits, and the short answers that she had attributed to introversion or distance, or the ordinary mysteries of adult children. That had been a loss that accumulated over years and had already happened long before this afternoon. Today had not taken anything from her. Today had given her something instead. It had given her the context, the frame around the painting she had been looking at for 23 years without understanding what it depicted. The backyard in the photograph was still the backyard she knew. The blue sweater was still the blue sweater she had bought at a discount store in the fall of Hangin Kong Tram Le Mot. But the girl wearing it, the girl who was already looking off frame at something her mother could not see, was not the mystery Margaret had always assumed. She was someone who had known, even then, what direction she was going. Margaret looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she placed it carefully back in her wallet, in the plastic sleeve where it lived, and she looked out the train window at the darkening landscape moving past and felt, for the first time in many years, that she understood her daughter. Not completely. Not in the way that mothers of ordinary children understand ordinary children, with access to the daily texture of a life, but in the essential way, in the way of knowing what a person is made of and what they have spent themselves on and why. That was more than she had had this morning. The train moved south. At 11:58 p.m., In the sedan that had been parked for the past 2 hours in an underground garage in Alexandria, Virginia, Derek Reese's phone received a second message. He read it. He looked at the partition between the front and back seats. "We have a location," he said. In the back seat, Mara had her eyes closed. Not sleeping, he knew, because she did not sleep in cars, had not slept in any moving vehicle in 14 years. The habit of a person for whom moving vehicles in her operational life had been insertion points and extraction routes, and neither category invited relaxation. She was processing. It was what she did in silence, the long interior work of a mind that had been trained to hold large amounts of complex information and find the pattern. She opened her eyes. "Where?" she said. Rice told her. She looked at the name of the city on the phone screen. She had been to that city before. Not under this name, not in this capacity, not in a way that appeared in any file that had been opened today or would be opened in the near future. She had been there in the way she had been to all the places that mattered, quietly, without announcement, doing the work that needed doing in the spaces that the visible world did not think to look. "When do we leave?" she said. "First available flight is at 6:15 a.m. She looked at the time. "Then we have time," she said. She closed her eyes again. The garage was quiet around them, the ambient sound of a city at midnight filtering down through the concrete, distant, muffled, the city moving at its overnight pace while the daylight world slept and the other kind of work continued in the spaces between. Outside, Washington was the way Washington always was at this hour, lit, purposeful, full of buildings that kept their lights on past midnight because the business of the country did not observe regular hours. The Hart Building was 3 miles north, its windows dark now, the hearing room locked, the evidence box sealed, the record of the afternoon cooling into the archive the way all afternoons eventually do, becoming history, becoming context, becoming the foundation of whatever came next. In a room on the 3rd floor that the afternoon's gallery had not known was occupied, the man with the file had long since taken the elevator down and walked out into the night and gotten into a car of his own, headed in a direction that no camera in the building had been positioned to record. He carried 6 names, and somewhere, in the classified architecture of a network that had taken 5 years to map and that was not finished being mapped, those 6 names were connected to others, and those others to others still, the whole structure extending outward into the ordinary world like roots beneath a lawn, invisible, systemic, patient. The work was not finished. It was never finished. It was only continued by the people willing to continue it, in the silence that the work required. Mara Hollis sat in the back of a parked sedan in an underground garage in Alexandria, Virginia, with her eyes closed and 5 hours before a 6:15 a.m. flight, and she held in her mind the 2 words that had arrived on the phone and the 6 names in the file, and the first 2 entries on the financial documents left column that had not been declassified today. She held them the way she held everything, steadily, without urgency, with the patience of someone who has learned that the distance between a name on a list and an outcome in a courtroom is measured not in miles, but in the particular kind of time that only one kind of person is willing to spend. The kind who doesn't need you to know. The kind you never see coming. She had a flight in 5 hours. She had work to do. There is a particular kind of courage that the world never sees. Not the courage of the charge, not the courage that gets photographed or decorated in public ceremonies with flags and cameras and the grateful applause of people who feel better for witnessing it. Those moments are real. That courage is real. But there is another kind, quieter, longer, and in many ways more demanding. The courage of the person who does the hardest work in complete darkness, who carries the weight of service without the relief of acknowledgement, who absorbs the doubt and the dismissal and the open contempt of people who have never sacrificed anything and who simply continues. Mara Hollis sat in that hearing room for 4 hours while a man with cameras and institutional power called her a fraud. She did not flinch. She did not explain herself. She did not ask the room for its sympathy or its understanding. She had learned, over 14 years in places that do not appear on any unclassified map, that the truth does not require an advocate. It requires patience. It requires the willingness to let the moment arrive on its own terms, fully prepared for it, and then simply open the folder. The lesson is not about revenge. It is not about the satisfaction of watching the powerful be humbled, though that satisfaction is real and earned, and the room felt it. The lesson is something older and more durable than any single afternoon in any single hearing room. It is this: The value of a person's contribution to the world is not determined by whether the world can see it. The 14 years that produced that folder existed before the folder was opened. The work was real before it was acknowledged. Tommy Reeves lost his leg before anyone in that room stood to honor it. The network that moved $412,000 toward violence existed and was being methodically dismantled by a woman the system could not find in its own database. And the dismantling was happening regardless of whether Dale Whitfield or anyone else knew her name. Service does not require a witness. Sacrifice does not require an audience. And the quietest person in the room is very often the one who has done the most. If there is someone in your life who serves without recognition, a veteran whose record sits in a file no one has opened, a caregiver whose work is invisible, a person who shows up and does the hard thing without asking to be seen, this story is about them. Tell them, not because they need the validation, but because the rest of us need the reminder. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to this channel if you believe in honoring the people who served in silence. Drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you are watching from, because these stories belong to all of us, and the community that keeps them alive is you. The mission does not end when the uniform comes off. It never did.